Yeah? Thank you, Father. This lecture, actually, is the second time I give it. I was in Rome and had it in front of Catholics. So I guess that most of you haven't heard it, or maybe none. So I think you have it a second time. Then the title was The Ontological Difference in Eastern Theology. And now the title is From Eucharistic Ecclesiology to Church's Polis. The theology of being is nothing more than metaphysics, according to Heidegger, which he understands as a kind of ontotheology, and as such it contributes to the Seinsvergessenheit of being. What Heidegger refers to is the ontological difference. It is the appearance of beings and not being in itself which brings into effect our awareness of being. Classical metaphysics, according to Heidegger, is caught in a forgettenness of being, Seinsvergessenheit. Since Heidegger, there has been an ongoing discussion about the ontological difference in theology, philosophy, sociology, and political science, as well from a theoretical perspective, as well as from a practical perspective. We also find a discussion on ontological difference within contemporary Orthodox theology, but more or less confined within theory, with limited impact on the practical reality. So, it is the appearance of beings, according to Heidegger, and not being in itself, which brings into effect our awareness of being. And that classical metaphysics does not consider the appearance of being in time and being itself. Since even the absence of being reveals the being, Heidegger continues. Heidegger differentiates between beings, das Seiende, and being, das Sein. Following Heidegger, the human being, das Sein, differs from animal rationale in the sense that we can relate to being in an ecstatic relatedness, existence. It is this existential awareness that makes it possible for us to transcend ourselves. The idea of ecstatic relatedness was fundamental to the existential understanding of human being by the end of the 20th century. Heidegger, however, did not manage to connect the idea on a practical level, and therefore the theory was not developed further in Sein und Zeit, being in time, which Heidegger himself identifies as a limitation of his magnum opus. Orthodox theology in the end of the 20th century suffered from the same problem of not connecting being to, or the idea of being, with any practical level. Heidegger himself argues that the reason for this is that the final step, Kehre, in fulfilling his theory, lacked the language necessary for such a study. There are some Orthodox scholars who have been engaged in finding the right language for finalizing Heidegger's Kehre. These scholars have been more or less successful. Examples given, Serhi Harouchi, but I would say that Heidegger himself, in his Kehre, misses the target. The reason why he was unable to finalize his theory was that he was caught in the belief of a presumed complete mediation of theory and practice. The complete mediation between theory and practice was an overwhelming idea among Marxist philosophers, examples given György Lukács and others. It was also the prevailing fascination in social theories of the Soviet Union. Though, this was already present in the beginning of Enlightenment, with absolute enlightenment propagated by Voltaire, effectively producing a subordination of the church in Tsarist Russia. Beginning in the middle of the 70s, the complete mediation between theory and practice was dismantled by the Frankfurt School, ending not only in the impossibility of a complete mediation of theory and practice, but even in its undesirability. Jürgen Habermas, one of the members of the Frankfurt School, in his critique of holistic claims laid out within Marxist ideology, argued from the standpoint of Hannah Arendt, the Jewish philosopher, that it's not the absence of being, with ultimate reference to death, that conditions being, but the actual presence and awareness of human beings are being born in the social arena, communicating, acting together. It is not, Habermas continues, ontology that conditions life, but life that conditions being. This reversed understanding of a relationship between das Sein and das Seiende threatened the entire prospect of metaphysics, as well in its secular sense, as well as in its theological sense. And by that, he created a storm of opinions and discussions. What we have missed is that the discussion continued within sociology. In social philosophy, Hjalm's view was reconstructed by scholars such as Nicholas Compridis, who constructed the idea of a primary and secondary disclosure. I also participated in sociology and reconstruct the parallelity of community action and ritual action. Thereby, we were able to show that it was possible to dismantle the ontological trap of Heidegger and at the same time preserve a language of metaphysics. What remained after this process was the undesirability of a complete mediation between theory and practice, which today is the prevailing pattern of thinking within sociology and political science. Ontology, without regard to praxis, or the ontic, means the exclusion of the spatio-temporal structures of everyday life. Furthermore, a complete mediation between theory and practice requires an absolute enlightened leader, which Voltaire was fully aware of and convinced Catherine the Great to embrace a complete mediation for the sake of the people. In the same way, the Bolsheviks embraced the complete mediation with the consequence of a dictatorship of the proletariat. Simply put, without a distinction between theory and practice, we need someone for realizing the mediation. To put theory in practice simply, if we choose to involve others, the outcome would be by necessity a compromise, which we call democracy within political science. It doesn't have a name in theology. Within Orthodox theology, the fascination of the complete mediation of theory and practice has prevailed with the argument that the church is different. This has been the further strengthened in the end of the 20th century by the theology of being, articulated by a number of scholars. This theology is certainly not false, it's correct. But what is missing is a fulfilled ontological difference by making a distinction between theory and practice. The inability to develop a theology with a distinction between being and being in time has far-reaching consequences. Existing problems are related to the never-ending sea of being. Instead of practical solutions in relation to the structure of a church, essential parts of organization are described in ontological categories, such as the bishop is a corporate personality, or that the church is communion, or the church is conciliarity, and so forth. With the ontological difference proclaimed, we have to add an ought. The bishop ought to be a corporate personality in his spatio-temporal existence. The church ought to be communion, and the church ought to be conciliar. Of course, it doesn't remove the ontological dimension of the church. The ontological difference just say that parallel to this ontology of the church, we have an ontic reality. Behind this prevailing ontotheology in the end of the 20th century, we have a development of the ontologically biased Eucharistic Ecclesiology, where the church is reified to its liturgical contingencies. Since Brian McPartland wrote the book that the Eucharist makes the church, this has been an enduring description of Eucharistic Ecclesiology. The idea that the Eucharist makes the church is hard or even impossible to find support for among the church fathers. Maximus the Confessor, which Andrew Love has shown, does not claim that the Eucharist makes it. Instead, he describes the Eucharistic act as a summit or recapitulation of a wonderful diversity, pleroma, a summit of all the activities and the entire life of a church. But the church does not exist only in its liturgical contingencies. The church embraces all of life. Certainly, the being of a church is contained in the liturgical vision, but the spatio-temporal solutions do not emanate from this being, at least not if we follow through the ontological difference. Unfortunately, the reduction of a church's liturgical expression was already at hand in the Byzantine Empire, where the church was effectively reduced in periods to a cultic apparatus, which was further defended by Orthodox theologians by necessity, in the same way as the case was during the communist oppression and in periods during the Muslim yoke. The freedom, or rather independence from imperial structures, requires a fulfilled ontological difference. Without it, the church will be reified to its liturgical existence. The problems that we encounter in the shadow of our ecclesial independence requires language, not mere philosophy, to be solved. As with any kind of human conditions, we need sustainable agreements based on mutual understanding and consensus, which in turn depends on linguistic communication and not predefined decisions written beforehand. Even more problematic is the negative outcome of his ontotheology, where being in the world becomes a negation of true being. I just went through several of the Orthodox scholars who is presenting ideas, often where they contrast being in the world with true being. What I believe is that we have to consider the ontological difference. It doesn't mean that we take away the spiritual life of a church. We incarnate this being in the life of a church. We become liturgical beings. We become liturgical beings in the liturgy after the liturgy. We take our human condition seriously. We don't take an escape to a life that is far remote from a practical reality. We have to solve problems together instead of propose already finalized solutions. We need to see the church not just as Eucharist, but a full polis, a full living community, but recapitulated, summarized in the Eucharist. And that's where I end, so what was perfect here. Thank you.